Okay, folks, we're going to get started. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank especially those folks that have come back in. We're about halfway full, and I know we're going to have other folks stream in as we start. We've got a very full afternoon of programs. We've got two additional keynotes and a plenary session. I want to welcome John Razzolini, who will tell you about our first speaker of the afternoon. John is Vice President and Director of Worldwide U.S. Government Markets for the Environmental Service Business Group of CH2M Hill, one of our platinum sponsors. John has more than 25 years of experience involving a wide range of environmental stewardship and sustainable development, public health, and natural disaster response and recovery work. He's a good person to have on hand, so thank you, John, for being here. John, could I ask you to come up and introduce Ambassador Barton, if you would, please?
Thank you, Dan. Well, it certainly is a high honor to be able to introduce Ambassador Rick Barton, Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations. That's the easy part. The hard part is summarizing what a remarkable career he has into a couple key points and then trying to connect with the audience. So here goes. I'll hit you up on a few of the points. First is, it is clear that Ambassador Barton has worked to improve U.S. and international response to conflict in more than 30 of the most unstable countries. He developed civilian strategies in Iraq, Sudan, and Sri Lanka. And he created new measurements of progress in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Ambassador Barton held positions including the co-director for the post-conflict reconstruction project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was the Deputy High Commissioner of the United Nations Refugee Agency, and he was the founding director of the United States Agencies for International Development Office of Transition Initiatives. He holds degrees from Harvard College, Boston University, and also has an honorary doctorate from Wheaton College. He's a son of American diplomats, and he's married and he has a daughter. And it took me to that point to find out that I finally had something in common with him, because I've been married many years and I have two daughters. And that brought me back to understanding conflict and stabilization. So right there I'm in and there I'm out. But I think really what summed it up best as I was learning about Ambassador was I found some information that was presented on his introduction at Brookings. And I'm going to paraphrase, but basically what I pulled away from this is that when President Obama and former Secretary Clinton, Secretary of State, were looking for someone who had been deeply immersed in the thorny issues surrounding fragile states, human security and prevention, and the mitigation and transformation of conflicts, they found the right person in Ambassador Barton. Please have a warm welcome for Ambassador Barton.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. Thanks to John, thanks to Daniel, thanks to Rodney Ben, thanks to everybody who's put this together, and thanks most of all to all of you here for your years of fine work in this field. I've had a chance to meet with you when this was a much smaller group, and there were kind of Saturday workshops, and there only seemed to be about 25 people in the room, and so now they have me in the blinding spotlight in front of thousands. So you've been doing well, and thank you again. It's a real sign of the great work you've been doing. I thought I would really try to spend maybe 10 minutes, and sadly I don't have a watch because I've got poison ivy, but you'll give me a signal here. And just to really bring you up to date a little bit on what we've been doing and to just set the table for a conversation, because I've seen you've had keynote speeches and keynote addresses, and I thought maybe a keynote conversation would be the best we could do in this slot right after your break. And what I'd like to do is just give you a brief update on this year that we've been in existence, because I think it's really quite telling in a lot of ways. Give you a sense of how we're gaining traction, talk about a couple of the nagging problems that I think we're facing that some of you obviously are addressing, and then just quickly summarize what the ambition is going forward. And put them in a summary fashion so it really just sets up the question and answer and the conversation with all of you. This new bureau, CSO, was created at the State Department a year ago, as you all know, as part of the QDDR process, with a very simple mission, which was to make the U.S. government more effective and more coherent in addressing conflict and crisis cases in order to break cycles of violence. So a pretty ambitious mission. And what we've tried to do in this first year is to focus about 80% of our effort in 4 major engagements: Kenya-related violence, Syria, Burma, the peace process, and Honduras and North Central America, the proliferation of homicides and really the loss of state control. I know many of you are working in these spaces, but we've also been in about 10 other countries and really tried to work across the conflict spectrum in every part of the world with a range of initiatives, always looking for multiple partners, being as opportunistic in that regard as possible, and with a default position, which is to build on the best available local opportunities. And I think we've gained traction in doing that by really emphasizing a few things. First, we've tried to go into places that really matter to the U.S. government, as opposed to trying to be all over the world at the same time with something relatively new. So we've focused on places that matter, and when we've looked at those places, we've tried to see whether there's a ripeness of place, whether going in at this time would actually make any difference. Another piece we've looked at is to make sure that we have rigorous, joint, independent analysis. I think we all know that if we send in an agronomist, the answer may well be that there's an agronomy problem. If we send in a refugee person, there are always refugees. If we send in a counterterrorism person, the answer might well be terrorism. And what really the United States, so that we don't show up in a place in all of our splendor, it makes more sense for us to focus on what's most important and where we can make the greatest progress. And so that's part of what we've been trying to bring to the policy and strategy shaping side of this conversation. Make sure that we have an emphasis on what it appears to be the most important issue. And then we want to see the implementation be done by those who are most capable. So that's not a default position to anybody, no sense of entitlement. We're not trying to elbow our way into the room, but really look for who is best placed to do the necessary work. And it can be anybody from one of our international partners to a private firm, to obviously USAID, who's our most common, most regular partner, but also Department of Defense or whoever seems to be best placed, the UN. And I think one very brief example I'd like to give you is in the case of Kenya. I think almost everybody realized that if Kenya went back into a cycle that it had faced 4 years ago during its last election, where over 1,000 people were killed, hundreds of thousands left their homes, and really the political elite that had driven the very negative process were back in the same places that they'd been in 4 years before, that the country of Kenya, that we all count on as an anchor in the region, and is really an anchor in Africa, would be at risk. And AID's Democracy and Governance Office put together a meeting for us in the Rift Valley, which we had looked at as one of the 2 hotspots in the country. And at that meeting, they had the 15 or so critical partners of the U.S. government. Since over $600 million of our $800 million portfolio there was really in the health space, we needed to have some of the people, obviously, that were working on AIDS as well as agronomy and the range of issues that AID and the U.S. government were advancing. And when we had that conversation, it was a slightly different one than usual. We didn't ask people to give us their portfolios and to describe their own work, but the conversation started off with, what do you think is most important in your country this year? And every single person in the room, every Kenyan in the room, and a few of the internationals said, election-related violence. If Kenya falls into violence, everything we're doing will not matter. And then we asked, are you doing everything that you can to help prevent that. And they all said no. And then we said, would you like to do more? And they said, yes, of course, because this is what's most important to our country. And then we got to, what might you bring to this particular challenge of hot spots, a police capacity that is not able to respond, a very rich civil society but not necessarily engaged in this problem, a political elite that seems to be manipulating people, and obviously the problem of idle youth and labor force that was available if needed. And the first person to speak was the agronomist. And he said, you know, I don't really have much that I can bring to this problem. I only have 4,000 people in my program in this area of the country. And I said to him, as a former politician, you could get elected governor of any state in the United States except for Texas with 4,000 people. And then the next person to speak was the AIDS program. And he said, we only visit 200,000 households in this area a week, and we don't know if that would be of any value. And we had two people on the ground, and they were meeting with the Catholic and the Episcopal bishops. They were meeting with the elders. They were systematically going around, and we had a number of wonderful AID programs. OTI had some great activities out there. But the issue that quickly came, the opportunity that quickly presented itself was there was this immense wealth of talent. They all knew what the most critical problem was, and all they really needed was to take their asset base, their connections, their communities, and direct them to the biggest problem in the country without totally interrupting their own work and without compromising that. And what they needed really was immediate additional Kenyan help to use their resource base to direct it to that problem. So that's something we were able to do, to come in a very timely fashion. And part of what we try to do is to look at that 12 to 18 month period, this immediate period when it's hard for some of the more normal programs to get going and to really accelerate what we're doing. Very quickly, a couple of nagging problems that I know some of you are working on, but I just, again, to stimulate the conversation. The first one that I wanted to mention is near-term public safety. I think all of us find that that is a real challenge in terms of being able to do our work. It's obviously the consuming interest of any local citizen. And part of what we have started to find is that there really are capacities and capabilities in the local police in particular that we are underestimating and that we have to find ways to motivate in greater form. Part of what happened in Kenya was that all of those citizen groups became an early warning system for the police, but they also became a way of, they created a demand on the police, so the police knew that they were not only getting help from the community, but that there was an expectation that they would actually have to do something. We found the same thing in Honduras, where basically a new tax has been passed, but the likelihood that the tax would be collected well, would be appropriated wisely, or would be spent appropriately was not that great, and so it's taking advantage of another local opportunity. The final thing I'd like to say in terms of nagging problems is really our ability to generate fresh ideas. From the time I had at the UN, I realized that the United States, in particular with this administration, was sort of being welcomed back into the world community in a way that we maybe had drifted away from during the first part of this century. But then the expectation was very quickly, okay, so what ideas do you have to solve these nagging problems? So it's not enough to just be there and have people thinking favorably of you, but what are you doing? And I think that there's some of our own behaviors that continue to get in the way of our being the idea generators that we need to be. In particular, I would say that we have a sense of entitlement to certain spaces, that I do that work, why are you in this space? And whether it's policy discussions, and oftentimes the State Department has an off-putting way with AID and with the Defense Department by saying, we'll handle the policy and the strategy, or whether it's an implementation where I've actually had people say, I'm not sure we need you in this country, we've actually got this problem solved. And I'm thinking, this person with 6 Greek gods would still be overwhelmed. But there is this sense of kind of a proprietary interest, which is keeping us from solving problems. And so what I'd like to do is offer a new metaphor for how we should think about these things. One of the ways we look at these problems in the government oftentimes is by saying, stay in your lane. And my feeling about staying in your lane these days is it's a very 20th century idea. Now, staying in your lane brings forward for me the picture of a swim meet and people swimming up and down in their lanes. But actually the games that we're playing in look an awful lot more like water polo. And it's the same pool, it takes many of the same skills, but actually people are pushing you to the bottom of the pool on regular occasions. There is a net at the end, there's a ball, there are significant differences. It's much more chaotic, it's much more dynamic. And we've got to get out of this stay in your lane mentality. I remember being in a meeting at the White House with Samantha Power, and she started off her comments by saying, well, I know this is way outside of my lane. And as it turned out, it was by far the most valuable contribution that was made by anybody in the meeting. And I remember saying to her after the meeting, Samantha, if you don't mind, please stay out of your lane from here on in. And so I would invite all of you to do the same, because I think we clearly need that if we're going to fulfill the potential that we have in these places. So finally, I just say that I think there is a real ability for us to make a difference in these conflict places. That's something that we have seen. Obviously, I've felt most of the 18 years that I've worked in this space and in the conflicts that I've been in. But to do that, we're going to have to get more coherent, we're going to have to get more effective, we're going to have to be more inclusive of each other. And I think if we do, this will obviously be a more peaceful world. So I look forward to your questions and comments and this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick, so much. You can see why Rick is a beloved and missed figure at CSIS. He's smart, he understands the politics, he's also got lots of ideas, and I think it's great that he's in public service, and I admire your public service very much, Rick, and so thanks for being with us today as well. There are a lot of smart people in this room who think about the issue of conflict and development, and I'm looking at Arthur Keyes, I'm looking at Rodney Bent, I'm looking at Matt McLean. I'm also thinking about, I'm thinking of, there are a number of groups here that do community policing work. There are some folks here from ICMA. I know Creative Associates does that. But why don't I first, I'm gonna put Arthur, I'm gonna put you on the spot, and everyone knows I'm doing this now. I've got this MO from doing this. If you bring the microphone up to Arthur Keyes, who's the CEO of IRD. Arthur, you think quite a lot about the issue of conflict and development. Why don't you, if you would, just kick off the conversation?
Well, Rick, I'm going to put you on the spot. It seems like a real hot spot is Syria. What creative and positive scenarios do you see there from the U.S. government and the NGO perspective?
Well, why don't I bunch a couple? Matt, you're a small business thinking of the intersection of civil-military affairs. You were in government for a long time as well, both at AID, at the National Security Council, and perhaps other government agencies in another life, but I won't say which ones. I can't remember at this point what the other ones were. But if we could get a microphone here to my friend Matt McLean. Is there someone coming with a microphone? Matt? And then I'm going to ask Rodney also. I'm going to ask you to comment as well.
Rick, good to see you again. Recalling my NSC days, one of the chief responsibilities of the White House was to integrate different agency activities and keep the policy in line. So in your position there, as you're dealing with various conflict and post-conflict places around the world, really two parts of the question. One, what are the key instruments that the United States government brings to bear? And two, how do you get that coordinated across different agencies? And what are some of the challenges there?
Okay, let me just do one more. This is World Bank style.
Just can you make sure I heard that, Matt? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Matt, just report that. Repeat that.
Sure. The question is, what are some of the key instruments that you think the U.S. government has can bring to bear in conflict and post-conflict situations? Particularly, there are some that are going to be tier one, and there's going to be other places that are not so tier one. And then secondly is, how do you at State Department help leverage or encourage or motivate or whip into shape different agencies and their swim lanes, if you will, to make sure that we're in a common objective.
Yeah. Okay, Rodney.
Rick?
Alonzo, I want you also to comment as well. I'm going to call on you as well. Please, Rodney.
This feels like collective punishment.
It is, it is.
Never sit in the front of the
I
classroom.
know, exactly. I can see you guys. You're in my line of fire here because of the bright lights.
You know, if he does this just right, I'll get all the questions and then I'll run out of time.
That's exactly. Exactly.
That would be the typical congressional appropriator mode. Rick, it's great to see you again. Congratulations on your job. I want to lash together two parts of your past, which is your UN work, and piggybacking a little bit on Matt's question, it's not just using UN agencies, U.S. government agencies. What do you see are the possibilities, and going back to Arthur's question about Syria, of working more internationally? What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of either group?
Okay, Alonzo, could I ask you also to comment? You're former mission director in Afghanistan, among many other jobs you've held.
Rick, once again, I want to echo the comments of Dan. Thank you for your continued government service at an excellent level. One of the questions I have is that we learned a lot of lessons from 2005 or 2004 to 2010 in regards to intergovernmental relations, trying to do a whole of government approach to addressing a lot of the problems that we're having in conflict areas. It seems as though over the last couple of years that whole approach has gone away. Clearly, there were a lot of lessons learned during that process, and I want to get a sense from you, what things have we taken away from that we will continue to use if the balloon goes up again and we have an Afghanistan situation?
Those will be the questions, Rick. Those four, promise.
All right. Okay, well, thank you. I mean, let me see if I can get through these. How much time do we have? Just
5.
Okay, so concise answers to good, tough questions. Syria obviously is a brutal challenge right now, and I just to set up the challenge in a slightly different way. When the revolution started, we didn't really know the people that started the revolution in Syria, so we didn't have a good base of knowledge of the place. And I've believed for some time that one of the critical weaknesses in the way the U.S. has approached many of these interventions, that we didn't know the places we went into. And I think Afghanistan and Iraq were sort of good examples of getting ahead of our familiarity with the place. And you really have to not only have knowledge of the place, you have to have then a common view of what the case is, which I also felt in Afghanistan, that we were fighting terrorism and we were building a model democracy, and we would compromise one for the other at almost any moment, and that's not a particularly good way to move ahead. In Syria, we had, the problem was compounded by closing the embassy and then really having to work out of neighboring countries. So we didn't really know the people, we didn't know the place that well, and then we weren't really able to work, we're not able to work in the country because of the nature of the conflict. So what we've done over the last year is really try to broaden our knowledge of the Syrians and the depth of familiarity with them. And we've used a number of methods to do that, but mostly training and equipping basically the nonviolent opposition, so the people who had started the revolution. And it's had to make them more, we've done that to make them more capable for today and for tomorrow. So we want them to be more capable in terms of possibly bringing an end to the conflict, but also when the conflict ends, so there will be some base of people who are going to be able to continue some of the reasons that the revolution was started. I think that right now, as people look at this, they see fragmentation as being the sort of the logical outcome of the conflict. And I think that part of what you have to do is you have to prepare for the best case scenario, because if you go the current status quo direction, it's probably not getting better. I think we have a pretty good idea what we have to do if things go really to hell. And so you've really got to imagine what would be a positive scenario. And my feeling is that most positive scenario that's available at the moment is a fragmentation with people who are really dedicated to some of the initial ideals of the revolution, which is to function in a more open, a more democratic, and a more peaceful way. And I think that is very much a a possibility, and that's what we're trying to prepare. And part of that is to give the training and equipping for communications, so that we've helped to establish a nationwide FM network that the opposition can actually talk to the people not working through the regime. We've done a lot of other mass media stuff that I think is useful, but we now have a base of over 500 Syrians that we're working with on a regular basis. And then we're also looking at just about to go to the Congress for more flexibility to help pay stipends and other things for the defected police and other people who are providing the public safety in some of these pockets that the opposition has taken control of. So there's still the larger problem of the conflict, which is, as you know, obviously the overriding concern. But within that, there's an awful lot that can be done, and that's really what we're trying to do. But it's still, the bombing is still the first thing that every Syrian talks to you about, and obviously that issue is still hanging out there. In terms of, I think maybe I can do Matt and Rodney's question together. I think clearly one of the key instruments that the U.S. government has available to it is to mobilize its allies, to mobilize the organizations that we're part of, and to mobilize our own government. But one of the standard problems of our government is that sometimes when we get mobilized, everybody brings their favorite toy, what they're used to bringing. And I think that gets back to having some greater coherence, and that if we really do insist on what is the most important challenge of the place, as opposed to everybody showing up in their splendor. I've been in endless meetings over many years where people say, the first question that's asked, we've got a terrible situation, what can the United States do? And I happen to think that's the wrong problem. I think the wrong set of questions. The right question is, what is most needed? Because if we can actually get the people of the place working on what's most needed, we have a much greater chance of success than we have by just bringing the splendor of all of our programs. Up until about 2 weeks ago, when Van Cliburn died, I described it as sort of the Van Cliburn, and then there he was on the front page of the New York Times. I had to stop using his name. But does anybody remember who Van Cliburn was? He looked like the concert pianist, central casting concert pianist. He had the white hair, he had the tails, he always looked spectacular. I see that, thanks. And he'd sit down, he'd flip up the tails and he'd sit down, and that's sort of what the U.S. government does. We arrive in these places, and then we have all of this talent and some money, and of course there were people who said that we would have been better off in Bosnia if we'd had everything at play, and so we put everything at play in Iraq, and it didn't turn out to be that much more successful. But we're doing cross-finger drills and a whole variety of other things, and I just think that these are places that they're so complex and they're so difficult to work in, much tougher than Washington. And how hard is it to get anything done in Washington? Usually brutally difficult. So let's really stay focused on one or two or three things that can be felt by the people of the country, because they generally have something that matters more to them than everything else. And we're not going to get it. It's not like a gigantic matrix where we're going to get everything right in that country. We've got to give them hope. We've got to give them confidence. We have to get some momentum going. And that's why focusing on what's most important to them is most likely to make us successful. And I think that's something the United States government has a real capacity to do. But we've got to have our own self-discipline to do that as well. And obviously the international community is a real natural partner. We have about 7 countries that are really looking at these problems almost the same way we are and are putting money to it. But we're all fairly small still, and the league is just developing, and I think that that's one way we'll get more influence. Alonso, just finally, I'm sorry to go over a minute or two here. In terms of the whole of government, I'm finding there's tremendous openness to working in partnership with every other part within the U.S. government. I find very few people who want to lone wolf any one of these problems right now. What we're trying to do is to say, let's do something concrete. Let's not just build rosters, and this is not a bureaucratic exercise of building capacities. Let's actually take a real problem and show that by working together, we can actually have more impact on it. And then let's let the let's show the capacity as a result of successes rather than the more bureaucratic mean, which is you give me $100 million, you give me 300 people, and I'll deliver this for you tomorrow, which I think that model is not going to work quite as well these days as taking on real cases, finding how we complement each other, and then making sure that whoever's best suited has got more leadership responsibility and has more implementation responsibility, and not a natural default to either a bureau or an agency or any part of the government. It's hard to do that. That doesn't sit quite with our practices, but our practices have not been so endearing that every taxpayer in the country is cheering us right now, and I think we have an opportunity to try something a little different and probably build more support.
Rick,
So,
thank you. Thank you
Thank
very,
you all
very much.
very much.
Please join me in
Congratulations.
thanking Rick Barton. Mirza, can I ask you to come up? I'm going to ask Mirza Jahani to introduce our next session. Mirza is CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation and in a past life was senior governance advisor in the Democratic Republic of Congo for DFID, as well as a governance advisor for Jordan, among many other posts. Mirza, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan. There are so many distinguished speakers already this afternoon, so I won't take too much of your time. My job is simply to introduce the moderator for this afternoon's panel discussion. But I do want to take up something that Tom Carruthers said, particularly. Tom and I first met when I was working for DFID about 5 years ago. And I felt that some of his presentation, and I spoke to him as he was leaving this afternoon, gave us a very strong understanding of what I call the demand side of governance. I hope you'll all remember the 4 words that he left with us, right? Accountability, participation, transparency, inclusiveness. All 4 of those dimensions of governance are what we used to call in DFID the demand side. What Tom did not talk about, which we did speak about with him when he came to see us at DFID those years ago, is what is the supply side of governance? How do you make local government or national government much more responsive than it is? That is a question that we are struggling with right now in the Aga Khan Development Network, because we've spent a long time looking at giving people a voice. We forgot to give government an ear. And I think the more of us that start looking at that dimension about how do you give government an ear, we might actually get the right connection between the demand and supply side. Before I introduce Larry Gerber, who is somebody at USAID that I'm beginning to get to know quite well, I should recognize Tom and Derek, who are chairing the working group for SID on our governance work. Tom, thank you very much. I don't know what Derek Brinkloff is, but Derek, we recognize you too. Larry is becoming a good friend of mine because I'm beginning to realize that one of the things that USAID has done in the last few years while I've been here is to shift away from having parceled out its thinking to bringing it back within USAID, as it should be for an agency. And I think Larry has been very instrumental in helping them set up their policy planning and learning unit. And I think it's a great pleasure for me to introduce you to Larry. Larry, please come on the stage, and Larry will then introduce the rest of the panel for this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Rick is right. This is hard to speak with the lights in your eyes, but we'll do our best. Thank you very much, Mirza. It's great to be here this afternoon, and it's my job to introduce and moderate this panel on governance, the diverse demand side. And I believe this fits very well into the themes that we've been talking about this afternoon, very much as Mirza was just saying. From where I sit, governance is a neutral term. One can speak of authoritarian versus democratic governance. We can speak of transparent versus corrupted governance. We can speak of effective versus stalemated governance. So we need to give some flesh to what we mean by the term governance, both from the demand side and, as Mirza was saying, from the supply side. And so in this session, we're going to talk about some of these issues from a bottom-up perspectives, but I hope that people will keep in mind the 4 words that Tom introduced us to, but which roll off all of our lips very easily. And again, just to repeat them: accountability, transparency, inclusion, and participation. And think about how some of the things that my colleagues on the panel are going to be talking about relate to these themes. What is it that we're doing in the governance field that does create accountability, that does create transparency, that does create participation and inclusion? We had just heard from Ambassador Barton talk about conflict, which is another piece of the puzzle also in the context of governance. I mean, our view of governance is that it should ameliorate some of the conflict that we see around the world in many of the countries in which we're working. So with that, and without further ado, particularly since I know that the last speaker of the day is my boss, Deputy Administrator Steinberg, and they're probably not going to give us the full time that we were allotted. Let me go immediately to introduce our panel. We're going to start with Teresa Barger, who has spent 21 years investing in emerging markets. She basically founded this at the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. She was Director of Corporate Governance for the World Bank and IFC from 2004 to 2007, and the Director of Private Equity Investment Funds from 2000 to 2004. She's the co-founder and vice chairman of the Emerging Markets Private Equity Association and a graduate of Harvard College and Yale University, and did graduate work at the American University in Cairo. Our second speaker will be Dr. Charles Benjamin, who has over 20 years of experience in international development, with extensive development in community development and natural resource management throughout the Middle East and Africa. He has been with the Near East Foundation since 1993, where he first began with a 5-year assignment as country director in Morocco. Charles has a PhD in natural resources and environment from the University of Michigan, with a focus on decentralization and local institutional development in West Africa. Our third speaker is Deborah Kimball, Director for Governance and Civil Society at Creative Associates, and she brings also extensive experience working in this field for more than 30 years, I believe. She's also worked as a city manager and has specialized in the area of governance, economic development, and change management. Deborah has worked in more than 30 countries, with her most recent assignments in Kosovo, Uganda, Cambodia, and Ethiopia. And then we're really privileged to have as our commentator, respondent this afternoon, Harris Khalik, who's the team leader for the UK-funded program called AWAZ, Voice and Accountability in Pakistan. And I'm confident that Harris is going to be a great commentator because he offers regular commentary for BBC and Radio Pakistan. So I'm sure he's quite accustomed to speaking quickly on his feet and reacting to different events. So with that, I'm going to invite Teresa Barger up to the microphone. And we've asked each of the speakers to speak no more than 7 minutes, so as to give some time for discussion with the audience.
Great, thank you, Larry. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me. I've been asked to talk about what investors need to see in terms of governance in order to be attracted to put their money into enterprises in a country. Let me start that I believe that one of the key planks of economic development is the creation of good companies that fairly and honestly create goods and services They sell to people at a price they want to buy them. And the development of sustainable businesses creates opportunity that allows people all along the chain, from employees to suppliers, to feed, clothe, shelter, and educate themselves. And one of the inputs that those businesses need is capital. And capital has many choices. We find that smart countries are understanding that they can make themselves into more attractive destinations through the provision of a fair playing field for market participants. The demand for political governance, most especially for low corruption, is a given, so I will turn specifically to corporate governance. This is a set of processes and procedures that companies use to guide their operations, and to ensure that the voice of all shareholders and stakeholders is heard, to ensure that even small shareholders and all shareholders are treated equally, to ensure that the controlling family is not taking what we call asymmetric benefits through all the tricks like tunneling and self-dealing, asset stripping, over-invoicing, transfer pricing, any others you care to talk about, and to ensure that management is accountable for meeting the strategic goals of the shareholders that are set by the shareholders' representatives, of course, the board. Of course, corporations can be self-policing, and investors can freely choose which companies they want to invest in. They can also walk with their feet and pull out their investment if they don't like the way a company is governed. But there is a hitch. In a private, non-listed company, the outside shareholders have to engage in a contract with the existing shareholders and the management of the company. So they have to have some faith in the rule of law, enforcement mechanisms in the case of a breach of the law, and settlement of disputes. And if the company is listed, it obviously is a whole different game. The presence of listed capital markets is a hugely efficient way to achieve optimal capital allocation in a country. It also provides an efficient mechanism for the investment of pension savings that can be a critical part of a social security system. It promotes capital accumulation, which is necessary for new company formation and the support of entrepreneurship. And it encourages savings, which most countries need to carry out infrastructure investment programs. But in a stock market, the contract between the investor and the company is the listing itself. There's no special deal to be negotiated with the controlling shareholders or the management. One buys shares from people one does not know, one sells shares to people one does not know, and that is hugely efficient. But it does not rely simply on trust. It relies on a pretty well-known set of securities laws. In most countries, securities laws are fine. Sometimes there's a problem, but generally they're okay. The problem is in enforcement, and the institutions charged with enforcement, inspection, and auditing of compliance. And I think probably everyone in this room could say that in a lot of areas they work in, enforcement is really the issue more than the laws, sometimes the laws. Normally, the problem will both be the will to create fair and impartial institutions, and then secondly, budget. So countries are eager to have stock exchanges. It's easy to get someone to come in and help you write securities laws. But what they really don't understand, that just like a nonprofit who gets a donation of a big old mansion, there's a huge ongoing responsibility for maintenance budget to go into the darn thing. And sometimes, also in these markets, practices just get bollocksed up. In 2000, Brazil found itself with a stagnant stock market with very little trading, only 8 new companies listed between 1995 and 2000, and the market capitalization represented only 25% of GDP. The Brazilian authorities asked a group of foreign investors to come in, take a look, and give them some advice. So they had a well-tuned ear. What they found was that the privatization program of the 1990s created a structural problem, an unintended consequence, which all of you will be familiar with. In development work, you always got to be aware of that. So what happened is the government wanted to list the state-owned enterprises, but they did not want to lose control. So, hey, I have a great idea. We'll have A shares with voting rights and then another class of B shares with no voting rights. So this way is perfect. The government got to get money from investors, but kept all the decision-making control. And then what happened? The private company said, that's a great idea. We'll have A shares and B shares. And it ended up that a controlling family could control all the decision-making in a company owning only 17% of the shares. And guess what? The minority investors said, look, we don't want to be patsies here with no voice. And they also became afraid of fraud, because what happens when someone controls the company only 17% of it? So with the work of two fathers and two mothers, as we say, one of the fathers is my colleague at Cardica Capital, the Novo Mercado was born. It's a listing segment of the Bovespa Stock Exchange where all the companies agree to have just one class of shares, they agree to dispute arbitration, and they have mandatory tender offers in the case of delisting or takeovers. It's often called the good governance segment of the Bovespa. After the Novo Mercado was firmly in place between 2006 and the financial crisis, we saw 58 new listings and market capitalization went to 100% of GDP. And the companies listed on the Novo Mercado were much more valuable than the ones that were in the bad old Bovespa listing. The enforcement side is still not perfect. Arbitration mechanisms are almost never used. No one's been jailed for insider trading, and no directors have been sanctioned for breaches. But the institution has been pretty good at using feedback mechanisms to tweak the system. For one, they created 3 levels of a Novo Mercado compliance when they found that companies needed time to adapt and comply. I don't have time to talk about what a mess China's corporate governance is in, or even about the newer markets of Zambia or Ghana. But to sum up, I would say that what investment needs is laws and institutional frameworks that are sensible. Number 2, enforcement of those laws to ensure a level playing field. And 3, feedback loops to ensure accountability. I look forward to this discussion. Many thanks.
Thank you, Teresa, and thanks for keeping within the time. Phil?
Thanks very much. So I'm going to shift realms a little bit here. I've been asked to share some thoughts on governance from the perspective of smallholder farmers and natural resource dependent populations. I'm going to ground my observations in northern Mali, which is a context that I know best. It's also an area where the organization I represent, the Near East Foundation, has been active for almost 25 years in natural resource governance. The points resonate, though, I think, with my experience in other parts of the world. First, rural communities have a remarkable capacity for self-governance when it comes to natural resources. Natural resources are a bread and butter issue for rural populations and a core focus of decision-making at the community level. In northern Mali, community-based natural resource management arrangements are ubiquitous and very complex sometimes. In a single Malian community in the north, you're likely to find one set of rules governing agricultural land, another set of rules governing fisheries and participation in community fishing, collective fishing, another set of rules governing who can access forest resources, when and how, and another set of rules governing grazing animals on collective pastures. These rule systems generally fall under the jurisdiction of multiple local authorities. Sometimes they're village councils, sometimes they're super-village associations, sometimes they're socio-professional groups, ethnic groups. Other times they're a single family that has a hereditary right to a resource. They're culturally rooted. They draw their legitimacy from the moral authority of the community rather than the legal rational authority of the state. These types of regimes are widespread in Mali and elsewhere in the world. I've worked closely with similar systems in Morocco, Sudan, and Senegal, and I'm sure that many people in this room have their own experience working with similar types of rule systems. Second, community-based governance systems are often dynamic and resilient. but they're not necessarily inclusive or fair. Based on local knowledge and the practicality of local livelihoods, they fit with the reality of local resource users, generally speaking. They're often resilient in the face of environmental, social, and political shocks, as Mali has seen plenty of in the past couple of years. People remember their rule systems, often across generations, even when they've been repressed by the state. And customary rule systems are often applied in stealth, in parallel to statutory legal systems and laws. In terms of resilience, for example, in northern Mali, many of the people displaced during the recent coup and the subsequent rebel occupation have settled in Douenza in the region of Mopti. Most of these people are farming now, and they're farming on land that's been lent to them by their host communities under customary arrangements. Many of them are grazing animals also based on community pastures based on customary arrangements. In spite of the essential absence of the state and of the turmoil caused by occupation. Outside of Mali, in Darfur, NEF has been working closely with communities to revive customary institutions that were for conflict management that were disbanded in the early 1980s. But they're still very much a frame of reference for the communities where we work. Now, they may work, but these customary systems have shortcomings, and they've been criticized for that. They aren't necessarily inclusive. And the communities themselves that support the rule system often have biases based on age, gender, and ethnicity. There are also often competing versions of what legitimate rules are among different groups. And this, of course, leads to conflict. Third, I've rarely seen a situation, in my experience, where there's a good fit between state and customary law. And in my experience, it's also very difficult to find a middle ground. Not impossible, but it's a process. States generally see customary law as regressive at best, anti-modern, and a threat to their authority at worst. Ambiguities in the law, lack of recognition of customary rights by the state, and lack of knowledge about statutory rights and recourse by resource users leaves resource users vulnerable to expropriation of their property, predation by the state and economic forces, and lost opportunities to leverage their assets. In Mali, in the peri-urban fringes, many smallholder farmers have lost their land holdings in spite of legal protections that they have for their customary rights. And the issue of enforcement, I think, is very important here. Forest services impose fines for activities that would be legitimate under customary rule. Further to the north in Morocco, so outside of Mali, we've seen with communities that we've been working with the USAID-funded agricultural water management project, that communities have a very difficult time accessing government subsidies to improve their irrigation systems because they have such a difficult time documenting property rights. So decentralization has been an important step in enfranchising rural citizens, but it brings with it a paradox, given this gap between statutory and customary law. In the past, it would probably be an overstatement to say that national law was irrelevant to smallholder farmers in northern Mali, but aside from occasional repression by the Forest Service, they kind of got on with their business. Decentralization has brought the state much closer to people. And it's made the laws and the mismatches more relevant to the day-to-day lives of these people. Even after decentralization, Malian law strictly defines the power of local governments and the kinds of decisions they can make regarding natural resources. In fact, when local governments apply national law, they often find themselves in the position of repressing custom. So when national legislation limits the power of local government in this manner, it risks undermining their legitimacy and credibility. My final point is a key challenge here is finding effective, enduring, and secure ways of bridging gaps between customary and statutory governance systems, even under decentralized regimes. Doesn't necessarily mean aligning legal systems, which is very difficult. It's difficult to codify customary law. What's often more important than the rules governing resource use and management themselves is the process by which groups make, change, and apply their own rules, self-governance. These are their collective choice arrangements, in the words of the late Lynn Ostrom. So I see bridging these gaps as a process rather than substance itself. I think it's important that rural people have adequate space for self-governance. It's important that state policies allow for rules that fit with the realities of local resource use. It's important that resource users have a voice in shaping policies that affect their well-being. And it's important, and in my mind, an appropriate role for state to promote more inclusive self-governance. So, thanks.
Deborah?
Okay, I think they've all done my speech. One of the things I really wanted to focus on in this last part of this is the whole issue of response. We've heard it mentioned several times. It was mentioned by the ambassador, but we really need to have government that can respond. And in my experience, and I will be talking from this perspective, is at the local level, you have the greatest opportunity to create a successful response to the civil society. Notwithstanding some of what you just raised about how the laws make it more apparent that the customary and state laws don't match, part of that is the formulation of the state law. So I'll get to that in a little bit. What I wanted to start it with, though, was just an experience I had in Cambodia where I was asked to lead a program on decentralization for the government of Cambodia, because they had experimented with the notion of more civil society involvement in government by having local elections. When they realized that that was going to be politically safe, they went on to then craft a decentralization law that we were asked to then develop a program for transfer of authority and power. In doing that, we ended up working with 15 different development partners, and the one thing we heard more than anything from all of them was, where's the voice of the people? How does the voice of the people show up? We thought in the sense that we had identified ways for the local governments or the subnational governments to really respond, our notion was, well, the people have to, they can participate in this, and here's the mechanisms for response. But that was never enough. And there were two things that struck me by their comments. One was when they talked about the demand side, when they talked about where's the voice of the people, they seemed to think that there's one voice. And as we all know, there is multiple voices of people. We've heard it on our panels already. And so at the local level, you're trying to navigate the diversity of all those voices. And the second thing that struck me was there were 15 different development partners, and they had 15 different definitions of what the voice of the people was. So right there, we were faced with a challenge. I think what I'd like to just spend just a few minutes here is to talk about, when we talk about civil society, what is it we're talking about? And secondly, how do we create an environment of constructive engagement so that we can really have a responsible and responsive governing system that works with civil society in a way that results in the changes that we're trying to see? I thought it was interesting, I read of the first part of Mr. Crowther's book, and he talked about the fact that we form these NGOs, we bring them to the table on dialogue, but we bypass the traditional leaders. We bypass the traditional groups. And one of the things I've come to realize in my work with Creative is that their work in Central America tapped into that. They recognized, among many other things that were reasons for success, but in their work on gang violence and youth, they tapped into the churches. Those are local organizations. They're trusted by the people. We have to make sure that we're not creating organizations for our own good, but really working with the traditional institutions. And this is going to be particularly important as we work with women. Women need to know that they can trust. They need to know that they're going to be safe, and they got to need to know that their assistance isn't going to go away. It has to be a stable organization. Contrast the work what I'm seeing in Central America with an experience I had in Tajikistan, where after doing a survey of the NGOs in the country, 90% of them said, we align our mission with our international donor. When we brought them to meetings of community meetings that had the mullahs, the local government, the media, and local leaders, one of the NGO leaders got up and said, I never realized that I wasn't really focused on the community. So I think both of those are very good examples of why it's important to work and react to the local environment. With that, what I really wanted to then end this with is, how do we think about this issue of constructive engagement? You know, if you think of civil society and know that it's not one voice, there's churches, there's youth, there's women, there's uneducated, there's educated, there's business people. I can tell you as a city manager, I could tell you about the 55,000 different voices of the 55,000 different people that lived in my municipality. There was not one voice. And that voice changed every time they got a new piece of information. So that's the reality of what's going on when we're trying to develop a response system. So we have to think about how can we work with them in a constructive way? How can we make sure that we aren't just tapping into NGO elites, but really bring in people? Can we create community opportunities where we go out to the people? My work in Kosovo, we really worked very hard with bringing youth together and helping them formulate what they wanted from the government. So there are ways to bring people together, but it has to be from what they want, not from what we think they should be doing. A second issue is to really get into this notion of constructive partnership or constructive engagement. There needs to be an understanding not only of what I want as a member of the civil society, but what does everybody else want? How do my needs compete or contrast or compare? We need systems that allow for that dialogue to happen. And I think at the local level, there's much more opportunity for that because people know each other, they tend to respect each other. There are ways, even in the mega cities, there are ways to bring people together because they have some ownership in what's going to happen in their own community. We need to have those dialogues so that people can see that my needs may have to be subordinate to someone's. They need to begin to understand that if we're asking government to respond, they're responding with multiple demands, limited resources, and in the local government level, typically limited discretion. So we have to address those things in creating a response system at the local level. Just a few things that to think about in that. If you think of individuals and their demands, they vote, they speak at public meetings, they might protest, they might circulate petitions. All of that is a request for something. There has to be a response. There has to be a good election management system. There has to be a way for local government to disseminate information in a way that makes sense to people. With the new social media, they have to be able to keep up with the changing waves of how people think, and youth think in particular. They have to have public record management systems so that they can document and demonstrate what's been going on. For organizations, they may advocate for change for a group of people. They may try to offer solutions. In both cases, there needs to be a body to work with that has the system, the capacity, the knowledge, the resources, and understanding of how to respond to that. In closing, what I'd like to just leave us with is a couple of things. We were asked to kind of outlay what we think would be necessary if we wanted to have a good demand and response so that it created this constructive engagement. What I've learned, I think, over the years that I've worked, particularly in the field of local government, is we need a good structure of local government in the decentralization framework. But, and this gets to my point earlier, most decentralization systems are top-down. They're created from the top and they flow down. I had the opportunity to work with the Local Government Advisory Board in South Sudan before the vote to create their own nation. And I started with, here's what an effective local government should be able to do for your people. And the response from our participants was, no one's ever talked to us about that before. They've all told us they all told us from a central level that this is the resources we'll give you. But there never was, what could we really expect local government to be able to do? And we need to formulate those systems and those government structures in a way that really lets them respond then to traditional values, traditional institutions. The second thing is there's a lot of discussion about public-private partnerships, working together with civil society, especially with the private sector, and even with NGOs that deliver services. There needs to be a rule of law. There needs to be ensure, similarly to our first speaker, there needs to be a way to have, if there's a conflict, that there's a court system that can adjudicate that system. And finally, there needs to be an open discussion about what should we expect from government, both in terms of understanding what the role of government is in our lives, and secondly, to make sure that not asking for something that they can't respond to. In that case, I think one of the programs that we're doing now in Libya is we're actually now engaging round tables where the citizens are working with the government to review some of the laws. We need to bring that discussion, that dialogue together at the same time. So those kinds of dialogues and discussions are possible, even at the country level, the national level. With that, I will close and let our respondent talk.
Harris, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll take 8 minutes and 30 seconds, Larry. Thank you very much. It is a privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to speak to you. And thank you all, Teresa, Charles, and Deborah, for making some insightful remarks and raising some pertinent questions. And I would try to respond to some of the issues that were raised here in the limited time that I have got, and would actually, rather than responding, would actually raise further questions. Because it's been really some very insightful comments that have been made. We have spoken about making laws, ladies and gentlemen, legislation, institutional frameworks that need to be made inclusive, sustainable businesses. Towards the beginning, we spoke about decentralization, devolution of authority to the local level, financial discretion at local level, and the ability of communities to have their own sources of revenue generation, community-based governance, the divide between state and customary laws, citizens' action, so on and so forth. All good things. Now, how do we go about doing all this? And from a developing country's perspective, which is my perspective, it is not lawmaking per se, as Teresa pointed out at the very outset. It is the enactment of laws which is the issue. So in many cases, you find sophisticated laws and sophisticated policies being promulgated, adopted, made a part of the law books, but the implementation and the enforcement is either sloppy or there is no enforcement at all. Because there's a traditional elite that captures the state and social institutions, and I picked up the word subordinate from here somewhere, so I call them subordinated classes and subordinated communities. And what the subordinated classes and subordinated communities, as it were, in developing countries face is two kinds of tyrannies as I look at those. And those have been mentioned here particularly by Charlie. One is the tyranny of the specificity of language in which laws and policies are created. And the other is the tyranny of the so-called modern knowledge, where all categories of analysis are borrowed from outside. This was also discussed in other words here. Because since people have no access to language, it doesn't necessarily mean that the language is an alien language. It could be their own language, but I'm not going to repeat the word, specificity of that language, the legalese or the particular jargon that we use, so that even if there are good laws, people can't even use those to their benefit. So in many ways, in developing countries like ours, South Asian countries for sure, modern statecraft is actually exclusionary. And what it has only successfully done in the past few decades is to include the new urban affluent middle class in decision making. So in effect, the landed elite that we had, or the highly privileged, share power, authority, and decision making with the middle class through the modern institutions of the state, and the process stops there. It does not reach the bottom 60 to 80% in developing countries. Because if you look at the emerging middle classes that we have associate with the powerful and with political power and with economic power, rather than speaking for the people. I think the agenda mentioned Lorax somewhere, so we are still searching for our Lorax from the middle classes to emerge, because unfortunately it is only the educated middle classes that can provide that kind of leadership to the marginalized and disadvantaged. And you spoke about social media, Debbie, and I think even if you look at the rise in the use of social media in our part of the world, it has also given more voice to the educated middle class and very limited voice to the poor. Again, because of the constraints that they have to face. So ladies and gentlemen, the state in our case has to switch sides now. And civil society has to advocate for that switching of sides. And switch sides from being a state which supports the powerful, from becoming a neutral state, and in the short while, becoming a state that sides the oppressed and those who are not included. And lastly, as my DI colleagues in Pakistan keep saying, that cracks have to be found within the system. And so we keep at it, nurture and support citizens' action from below to make centers of authority and decision-making spread more horizontally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harris, and thank you, each of the panelists, Teresa, Charles, Deborah, for your insightful comments and for really taking a topic and providing some very specific examples in a relatively short time. We have some time for Q&A, and so I'll recognize folks, and I'll hold off, but I have a couple of questions of my own, but I'd really rather recognize some of the folks from the audience. Okay, well, if someone can wave, or anyone with a microphone can help me out. Okay, I see in the back over there, someone waving their hand. So over in the back.
Thanks a lot for that, as you said, Larry, a ground-based panel. But I do have a question about the gender issue, because it's come up again and again with regard to inclusiveness. And often in developing countries, the leaders of gender inclusion tend to be the middle class. And maybe this goes to Harris's point at the end, and to the point that Charles raised with regard to Northern Mali, where in fact customary laws don't include, in many cases, women. So how do we square the circle? How do we as external agents who have common cause with perhaps the elite also recognize and advocate for the excluded to be part of the included? I really find that this really comes home with regard to gender. People can make the argument that it comes home with regard to youth in some cases as well. But I think the gender issue, which is a matter of U.S. policy, is so important, is one that's very, very difficult to solve in this framework that you all are talking about.
Emmy, thanks a lot. I mean, that was actually where I was going to go also, because in hearing the presentations, the word gender didn't come up, and I really was curious in each of these contexts how we would see a more gender differentiated approach apply, because in some contexts, I mean, I think it would be quite different whether we're talking about the impact of some of the things we're talking about on men and women. So I definitely want to give time for each of you to answer that, but if there is one other question, I'll take it before we go to the panel. Anyone else? Okay, so, and I'm sure our next speaker is going to be very interested in what you all have to say on this issue. So we'll start, Deborah, with you, since you're sitting at the far end.
It's interesting because we're having a discussion about this back in my office, and one of the ways we've been talking about it is, at least in part to address the issue, is to begin to make gender issues economic issues that resonate with the men who are making decisions. So if we're talking about the issue of sufficient labor in your company, you need a healthy labor force, which relates back to mothers being able to feed their children. So I think one of the ways that I've seen it work, that I think I've worked on it myself, is to some degree defeminize some of the issues. I know that sounds like heresy, but if we keep calling them women's issues, they become subordinate to all the other issues. We've got to make them economic mainstream issues, so it means we got to use that language so that it resonates with the people who are making the decisions, and as a way possibly to bring in more inclusion.
But how do you deal with the reality of the people making the decisions are often males in these settings, whether it's in local government or it's in civil society? And even the way you've framed it of making the decisions to take into account of women. I mean, how do you give women their voice in these settings at the local level?
I think when we talked earlier about working through local traditional institutions. I did some work in Azerbaijan, and one of the things that was clear immediately was you couldn't use traditional public or citizen participation programs where you expected women and men to come together. It wasn't going to be accepted in their country. But what we did talk about was, how do you get women to be able to work together to formulate what is needed and get that information to the people who will make the decision, so that their voice may not be initially at the very meeting, but it will be at least the information that is necessary. There's going to be somebody who's going to recognize this as in their own self-interest. And I think what I tried to express, we talked about was deal from the fact that most people work from meeting their own self-interest. And if you can tap into that, you can tap into broadening space for women's involvement.
Great. Teresa, you work in a world where these issues come up in a slightly different context, but I'd love to hear your reaction to the question that Emmy posed, or just more generally how you deal with it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I feel sort of a little bit of an outsider in this world, but in terms of this, not that the only thing I deal with is corporate governance, but in terms of corporate governance, there's a lot of work that shows that if you have one woman on a board of directors, it makes no difference. If you have two, it makes a big difference. And if you have 30 to 40% of board members, then the current data shows that companies become more valuable. And interestingly, so more valuable meaning that they'll fetch a higher price-earnings ratio. Interestingly, there's some new data that shows if the boards are more than half women, then you go back to the bad old days. So it's a kind of a new field. We don't know what to make of it. The Nordic countries are mandating that companies must be either 30 or 40% boards must be women, or else they take away their license to do business. And there are a lot of people that feel that's a little ham-fisted. In terms of women's economic inclusion, I think we're seeing Japan now saying, how can we develop this country if women aren't working? So Abe is now starting with, how can I provide support to women to get them to work? New York Times last Sunday article that said working women is not an issue in the US. What's the issue is supporting those women. It's not if they should work, it's how do you support them. Abe is actually starting off with that bit of it. And Saudi Arabia now is finding, a Bloomberg article yesterday, finding that there are more women graduates of both colleges and higher degrees than there are men, and how do they include them in the workplace? And the workplaces offer women only, women plus men conservative, meaning they could be women plus men segregated, women plus men conservative, meaning they could be in the same open space but far away, and women plus men relaxed. But one manager said, look, if women think they can't work beside men, they're just not realistic. This is not the real world. So I think people, in terms of economic opportunity, both for overall economic development of a country as well as the company level and the personal level, I think this is being grappled with all over the world. So I will leave it there on the systemic side. I don't know. Ask Charlie.
Charlie, you have your comments were on places like Mali, Darfur, places where these issues are quite difficult. And you particularly were talking about customary law. Right. And I'm curious how one deals with sort of a modernizing law on the one hand that may be addressing these issues versus customary law that, you know, clearly speaks from the bottom up, but may have, you know, quite significant gender impacts.
So I think that
Bring it closer.
gender is like age and ethnicity at a community level. There are deeply rooted social and cultural biases that are difficult to overcome and can't be forced from the outside. So I see change as a gradual process. And, you know, I think in terms of helping local people find their voice in government, but I also think that, and this is kind of where we are right now, helping marginalized people find their voice in their community. When we started in Mali working with these negotiated local conventions, these multi-stakeholder agreements that we were working with to bridge customary and statutory law, we would mandate a certain number of women representatives from each community. And at the end of the day, they would be in the back of the room, they'd be serving tea, they'd be making lunch, and it just didn't work. So as much as we try to you know, bring them into the conversations, they were culturally conditioned not to speak. So what we started to do was to organize parallel processes where women could organize themselves in ways that were meaningful in their own domain. In Mali, you know, irrigated vegetable gardening was one of the things that we worked with. In Morocco, it was literacy courses, and eventually, when women, you know, I remember when I was with NEF in Morocco, one of our field agents said, we're working with women in the High Atlas Mountains, said the most difficult thing that I do is try to get the women that we work with to think about tomorrow. So they were in this world, and it was a change. It was their own change of perspective. Ultimately, by learning how to read and write, they you know, we talk about empowerment. It was one of the most empowering processes that I've ever seen, and they were able, after that, to engage in decision making at the community level. And I think more and more what we've seen, even in elected government, some of the women who we've worked with at the community level, in Morocco in particular, have now been elected to the municipal councils because they've found their voice and they've found their allies in working with other women. So
Great. Harris, bring us home here. How do you mix the top down, the bottom up, particularly on an issue like gender empowerment and the realities that we face in terms of including women, whether it's in the economy or in the politics, in societies where that hasn't been the tradition?
Well, thank you, Larry. I think very quickly, I mean, I would like to, because I think the session is about to be over, I would actually want to end it on a positive note, because there's something really fascinating that we have observed in Pakistan in the past 20 years, and that would partly answer your question also. There is a silent, largely unreported transformation that has happened. And you see the educated women, I mean, they outnumber men by you know, any percentage you could think of. I mean, after 15 to 20 years, it will be very different. They dominate the universities, medical schools, law schools, engineering schools, everywhere. They are more, I mean, and then the participation in labor force. In the last parliaments that we had, 22% of women parliamentarians were responsible for doing 74% of the total parliamentary business. So I don't think they actually need, I would agree with you, I don't think they actually need any sort of, you know,
support which is patronizing in nature, as it were, I'm sorry. It's kind of supporting working women, supporting women in leadership positions, and supporting women from, from the farmer and labor women that we have. It's a largely agrarian country. So I think a lot of it is happening, and it's just to support, be a catalyst, to support, and to be on the right side of history, actually. Because very quickly, I would actually tread very carefully when we speak about state versus customary laws, because I agree, as somebody from the audience said, that customary laws, I mean, I wouldn't want to have any negotiation with any proponents of customary laws when it comes to women in certain parts of Pakistan, if not everywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank everyone on the panel for their participation. Congratulations. Congratulations to the organizers of the conference, and I can assure you your closing speaker will address this issue from his own perspective, as well as I'm sure several other issues of interest to the community. So with that, have a good rest of the afternoon, and congratulations.
Okay, folks, thanks for bearing with us. This has been really quite a rich and interesting day so far. We're really quite fortunate to have Deputy Administrator Don Steinberg to be with us today. Don is somebody who's trusted by both the Career Foreign Service at AID, and he's also trusted and respected by the Career Foreign Service at the State Department. So he's an excellent bridge builder within aid and state, and someone that people in the Career Foreign Service at AID look to. And so I think he's someone who's got a lot of experience in government. He also had he was an excellent U.S. ambassador to Angola. He helped build the partnership, the seeds of the partnership between USAID and Chevron in the 90s, and before that, public-private partnerships were cool. He also, where you were at the International Crisis Group, if I recall correctly, and so has a lot of familiarity with conflict and conflict resolution. Was the Senior Director for Africa at the National Security Council, was Deputy White House Press Secretary, Director of the State Department's Joint Policy Council, and he was also Special Haiti Coordinator, so all the garden spots in. But Don is joining us. This is I hope he'll come back next year in his new capacity. I think many of you know that Don is starting on July the 1st as the new CEO of World Learning. So he's leaving public service and joining one of the folks here in the family. So I think it's really great. I was really pleased to see that news. And so, Don, without further ado, please come on up. Come on up, Don. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That's a great introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity to wrap up this session. I wanted to begin by saying that my list of the 10 steps that AID needs to take to better accommodate us in the NGO sector include... Oh, wait a second. That's my speech for next month. Here we go. It is a great honor. Sorry, it worked well in my office, at least. It's a great honor to have the opportunity to wrap up this session with a few thoughts on the challenges that we all face in delivering effective development assistance in a changing global environment. I have had the pleasure to partner with many people in this room for more than 3 decades, beginning in the Central African Republic, where I served as a junior State Department development officer, all the way through to visiting many of your projects in Egypt and South Sudan and Georgia and Colombia, Bangladesh, and 2 dozen other countries since I've returned to government. From this experience, there's a single message that I take, and that is that no government, no international organization, no NGO or private company has a monopoly on good ideas, on ground truth, on financial resources or on moral authority. We're much better when we work together. I've admired the professionalism, the dedication of the work you do in the humanitarian, the recovery, and development world. I've often said that you are in the darkest and the nastiest corners of the world, the eyes, the ears, and the conscience of the global community. You know, we come together at a time of great hope and great challenge in the development arena. President Obama summed this up in his historic pledge in his State of the Union address a few months ago. He said, and I quote, it's always good to quote the president, the United States will join with our allies to eradicate extreme poverty in the next 2 decades by connecting more people to the global economy, by empowering women, by giving our young and brightest minds new opportunities to serve, by helping communities to feed, empower, and educate themselves, by saving the world's children from preventable deaths, and by realizing the promise of an AIDS-free generation. When he finished giving his speech, the first thing I did was to cancel my leave plans for the rest of the year. The President's pledge mirrored in statements from the World Bank President, and as you've heard from John Podesta this morning, the MDG 2015 High-Level Panel report. It's more than a pipe dream. Working together, we have moved 600 million people across the poverty line since 1998, a drop of nearly a third in just 15 years. In that same period, real incomes in developing countries have risen 60%. Infant mortality down by a third. Primary school enrollment up by 15%. Child deaths last year totaled 6.9 million globally. That is a horrendous number, but it is by far the lowest in my lifetime. We're also seeing democracy much more widespread around the world. In Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the number of democracies when the Cold War ended was 3. Today, it's about 24. Never before have so many of the partner countries that AID works with have been democracies. And yet, as we pursue the President's vision by tackling disease and illiteracy and unemployment, weak governance, climate change, we know that the world that we operate in has fundamentally changed for all of us, not just government, but for civil society and the private sector alike. First, assistance budgets are tighter, and our funders are demanding greater effectiveness, accountability, and transparency. They want to help countries generate their own capital for development, like South Korea and Brazil and India, and they're insisting on sustainable country systems able to stand on their own. They're demanding new efficiencies, and that's indeed one reason for the President's proposal before Congress now to reform how we provide food assistance. Let me assure you that untying food aid will give us a new tool in the fight against hunger and malnutrition, allowing us the flexibility to help more people more quickly at no more cost. At the same time, we need to recognize that official development assistance simply isn't the driving force that it used to be behind development. In broad terms, the U.S. government provides some $30 billion worth of development assistance each year. And yes, we all know that's less than 1% of the federal budget. But by contrast, NGOs, foundations, faith-based groups, corporate social responsibility generates $38 billion each year. Another $100 billion is provided by U.S. citizens and residents in remittances, and $1 trillion goes to developing countries and private capital flows from all sources. But equally important, developing countries now generate about $8 trillion each year for their own development through domestic resource mobilization. And so our respective roles have to change. In government, and particularly at USAID, we're using our convening authority to draw together partners, including NGOs and the private sector. We're making strategic investments that leverage other people's money, including by reducing risk factors. We formed some 1,600 public-private partnerships now. For example, at the G8 summit last year, President Obama brought together donors, private companies, civil society, and the governments of developing countries and their people in a new alliance for food security. This initiative matches market reforms from African governments with private and NGO commitments to lift 50 million Africans out of poverty within a decade. Already, NGOs and some 70 companies, half of them African firms, have committed $5 billion towards African agriculture. Similarly, last June, we joined with UNICEF in developing countries to host the Call to Action in Child Survival, with the goal of rallying the world behind the effort to eliminate preventable child death within a generation. Since then, we've had 170 countries, led by Nigeria, Ethiopia, India, Yemen, and Burma, come forward to pledge to reduce child mortality. And we've had 420 civil society organizations, more than half of them faith-based groups, to come forward with similar commitments on their own. I think this is really important because the third big change is that we are now living in a world of empowerment, what I call the democratization of development. Governments and civil society in our partner countries will no longer accept programs and policies made in America, any more than they'll accept policies and programs made in Brussels or London or Beijing or at the World Bank, for that matter. They are demanding control and ownership over their own development efforts. And with the rise in democracy and civil society's voices, we're more and more confident that these efforts reflect the true voices and aspirations of citizens of developing countries. I will address another aspect of that in just a moment. Fortunately, as we move ahead in this space, there's a growing consensus on the discipline of development, reflected in the outcome document of the Busan Conference, the work of the Global Partnership on Effective Development Cooperation, which I serve on as a steering committee member, and the MDG high-level panel. Busan put results at the center of our development agenda. It backed those results orientation with tough monitoring mechanisms to assure accountability. Transparency was brought forward, including with our own accession to IATI and the launch of our dashboard. We also took a first step at bringing new actors like China and India under the tent. Building on the Monrovia principles, we highlighted the unique challenges of fragile states in a new deal to help these countries. We reaffirmed our common commitment to disaster risk reduction and resiliency. And perhaps equally important, we pushed back on the dangerous pattern of closing civil society spaces in many developing countries, which is, of course, symbolized by the deeply troubling court decisions in Egypt just a few days ago. Fourth, we're entering an era in which science and technology and innovation are the coin of the development realm. People around this country are engaging in data paloozas and crowdsourcing, tech challenges, and hackathons. I'm from an older period where hackers were bad people. And now I'm working with an organization that calls itself Random Hacks of Kindness, which I love. And as I go around the country, I'm meeting more and more tech-savvy young people who hear the president's challenge about eliminating poverty within a generation and are taking their tech skills to devote in this effort. I went to the University of Denver recently where students are standing up against trafficking in persons, and they figured out a way to take a cell phone, put an application on it, so you go into Walmart or Target, put it up against the barcode of a product, and it will tell you how much traffic labor was involved in producing that good. They're in the process of working with students at 7 universities around the country to develop the database necessary to do this in a responsible way. And if it works, they're planning to do it with child labor next. And then they're planning to do it with tropical forest deforestation. Then they're planning to do conflict minerals, and pretty soon you'll have a socially responsible indicator in your cell phone. And just think of the impact that's going to have. As I go around at other college campuses, I've met kids who are devising solutions to getting deadly arsenic out of drinking water in developing countries, ways of using the 6.5 billion cell phones that we have in the world to diagnose immediately diseases like malaria and tuberculosis, and to devise solar-powered respirators to help newly born children in Africa survive their first 72 years, years would be good too, but 72 hours. And in each of these efforts, the students are coming up with the ideas, but we all need to dedicate ourselves to taking these ideas to scale. And that is particularly where I believe the private sector has a role to play. Finally, I think there is a new recognition in the development arena that development has to be inclusive. And I mean that in 2 senses. First, development has to be about more than 6 and 8 and 10% per capita growth rates. Growth is essential for sustainable development, but it has to be equitably distributed. It has to be free from corruption. It has to create jobs. And it has to be reflected in improved housing and health care and education and other needs. I'd simply remind you that the Arab Spring occurred in countries that had experienced very rapid growth rates, but the lack of jobs and equitable growth produced a social revolution. I think development has to be inclusive in another sense, and that is that it has to be a whole of society exercise, where all groups are included as planners, as implementers, and as beneficiaries. We simply cannot afford to continue excluding marginalized groups, whether it's women, people with disabilities, the LGBT community, displaced people, indigenous populations, young people, ethnic and religious minorities. These groups have to benefit from development, but equally important, they have to be given the opportunity to bring their full talents to bear on the challenge of national development. And we have to listen to them. We have a catchphrase at USAID that all of my colleagues are sick of hearing me say by now, but the phrase is nothing about them without them. Use their leadership and their moral authority to help drive our efforts. And so I wanted to use my remaining time by giving you just a few snapshots of how USAID is trying to accomplish this on the ground, and in particular to focus on the role of women in development. So right after I came back to USAID about 1,000 days ago, I visited a FOD university in Khartoum, this incredible women's university. And we sat and we talked about their role in the various peace processes in Sudan, and they said that they had been systematically excluded from the North-South dialogue, from the dialogue in Darfur, South Kordofan, Blue Nile. And as a result, they believed that these peace processes and the agreements that came from them did not reflect the reality of the country, and they were the key reason why these agreements had failed. So we responded by creating a global program which provided $14 million to ensure that women are empowered to participate in these processes with stipends, with training, and with physical protection. Because we all know that one of the most dangerous professions in the world is a woman peace builder. Shortly after that, I went to the Dolo Adu refugee camp in Kenya, where tens of thousands of Somali refugees were streaming across the border. In contrast to previous disasters, programs from USAID and the State Department and UNHCR were helping to prevent and respond to sexual violence among the refugees. They were addressing the special challenges of disabled women. They were expanding reproductive health care systems, and they were ensuring access to clean cook stoves. We haven't always been very good or very consistent in our record in engendering our emergency responses, but I believe there has been progress. Last May, I visited Batangas in the Philippines, where we have a program that gives women titles to land that they've lived on without titling for many, many years. And so I had the opportunity to hand out a group some of these titles, and I would let you know that when President Obama did this in Colombia, he had Shakira go with him. I was not so lucky, or maybe I was luckier. I had Gloria Steele, our mission director in the Philippines, come with me. And as I was handing out these titles, one woman grabbed my hand and simply would not let go. And my security people were coming up and saying, "What's going on here?" And she said, "No, no, no, I just want to tell you my story." She said that she'd lived in a community outside of Manila for decades, that when she first moved there, she lived with her husband, who had very rapidly after that died. When he passed away, she couldn't transfer the land title to her name, and she said that every single morning, she and her children woke up saying, "Are we still going to be on this land when the day is done?" She said that she couldn't invest in the land because she couldn't get credit based on the land title. And more importantly, she didn't want to develop the land because she was afraid that someone would take it from her. She held up the title and she said, "This piece of paper changes everything." A couple months later, I went to Tokyo for the Reconstruction Conference for Afghanistan, and I had attended the first Reconstruction Conference in 2002 in Tokyo, and we did not pay very much attention at that conference to women's rights, women's empowerment, and protection. But in 2012, we brought Afghan women civil society activists there. And backed by foreign donors, they cited all the progress that had been achieved since the fall of the Taliban. And it is pretty amazing if you think about it. Life expectancy in Afghanistan has increased by 20 years in the space of a decade. Just think about that. You used to die at the age of 42 to 47. Now you die at the age of 62 to 67. We've also seen maternal mortality rates sliced by 60%. We had no girls in school in 2002. We have 3 million girls in school today. What was equally exciting was to hear Hamid Karzai have to respond to this. And he did so by reaffirming that he will not sacrifice the rights and the progress of women in the pursuit of a false peace. And so as we look ahead to preparing the groundwork for the removal of our combat forces for Afghanistan, everyone is talking about training the police and training the military. I personally believe what we need to do is to consolidate the gains that we've achieved for women and for other disadvantaged communities there. The final story I wanted to tell was about a trip I took just a few months ago to Guatemala. Guatemala is a country that has faced tremendous problems about domestic violence. Until just a few years ago, domestic violence wasn't even a crime in Guatemala. It was a cultural practice. And in support of a tremendously courageous Attorney General, Octavia Paz y Paz, we have worked very closely to reverse this pattern. So one of the places I visited was the one-stop assistance center for women who have been hurt by domestic violence. And you come in the front door, first person you meet is a doctor, next person you meet is a police officer, next person you meet is a judge who will take your complaint, next person you meet is a psychosocial counselor, final person you meet is a career counselor who's going to tell you what you can do. You know, go to a safe haven, go to live with relatives, you'll be provided a little bit of a stipend, etc. And the difference between when women walked in the front door and when they walked out the back was startling. And then after visiting Guatemala City, we went up to a small town called Nabaj. In Nabaj, we have been working with indigenous women to try to help them come together for their own economic advantages and to fight domestic violence. And they were telling us about all the work that they've been doing with local community leaders, with local companies, petitioning the federal government, etc. But what was really significant to me was about halfway through our luncheon, a man stood up. And he said, you know, I joined this group a couple of years ago, and the reason was that when I was a young boy, I watched my dad beat my mom. It happened virtually every Friday and Saturday night. He would go out and get drunk, and he'd come home and beat her. And I was powerless. I felt emasculated. I couldn't do anything to stop it. And so when I grew up, in order to prove that I was a man, I started beating my wife. And I did this for many, many years. He said, I knew it was wrong. I joined this group. I've heard the stories. I've gone through the psychosocial programs. 8 months ago, my wife gave birth to a boy. And I held that boy in my arms. And I looked down and said, enough is enough. It stops with me. And he said that he had gone the last 8 months without any domestic violence and that he would do that for the rest of his life. So as we think about what we're doing in the area of development, as we think about all the concrete metrics that we can use to show how we're creating sustainable results, I think it's really important to remember that woman in Batangas, those women at SID University, and perhaps most importantly, that man in Guatemala whose life we've changed forever. I think we can be proud of the work that we're doing collectively in this space, and let me guarantee you, we have the support of the American people, because I believe that in a changing global environment, the generosity, the enlightened self-interest, and the humanitarian spirit of the American people is one thing that hasn't changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. You take a couple questions?
Sure.
Okay, great.
True or false, please?
Right.
Just true or false or
Right.
multiple
Softball
choice?
questions only. All right, so who wants to ask the Deputy Administrator? Who's got questions for the Deputy Administrator? I've got them. I have several of my own, but, as you guys know, I'm happy to call on you. Yes, the woman here in the second table.
First of all, thank you for your very moving remarks. And I actually remember you from Angola when I was working there with NDI.
Right.
Always very impressed. A couple of themes came up today, some of which you mentioned. One is a tighter budget for foreign aid, obviously. Second is a convergence, or at least a sharing of ideas of major donors on what works and what doesn't. Third being more serious efforts at measurement of results. And to echo earlier what Tom Carruthers said about political development, I'm actually a governance person, so I was concerned with that. Sort of bringing all of this together, one thing I was thinking of, other donors that were mentioned, including DFID, which DAI has worked quite a bit with, the Germans that were mentioned earlier, are looking at much longer-term programs, which also connects with the issue of measurement and attribution over time. How do you see that trend in relation to USAID, and especially when you're facing the issue of tighter budgets? Thank you.
I think we are indeed facing a period of tighter budgets, and I think in that context we have to be just very, very careful in some ways, and we have to recognize, as I was saying before, that we have to take chances in other ways. And so what I want to see is us reinforcing the patterns of monitoring and evaluation to be able to show the American people that we are achieving results, that we're not simply putting money into a system, not getting sustainable development, not getting a system where we can graduate countries out of the development assistance, creating situations where there is not aid dependency. So all of those obviate for the question of expanding monitoring and evaluation and accountability anecdotes, but also hard evidence. The flip side of that is what I was saying earlier, that we need to take some chances for development. We need to identify game-changing innovations and put resources behind them. We need to focus and concentrate our efforts so that we can have the kind of depth and scale so that we create differences on the ground. But I also think it's important to remember that we have seen a sea change, in my mind, here in Washington on the development area. I think the members of Congress who we talk to, the staff members, and even those American people that we're always talking about, get it. I think they understand that prosperity and human security abroad is in our interest. It's in our national security interest because stable and prosperous countries don't traffic in drugs, in weapons, in people. They don't transmit pandemic diseases. They don't send refugees massively across borders or across oceans. They don't serve as hosts for pirates or terrorists. And frankly, they don't require American troops on the ground. Some of our biggest supporters in the development area are congressmen and women who come from districts with major military bases because they get it. We had Admiral Stavridis come and talk to us recently, and my comments about Afghanistan are largely taken from him. He said, we are not going to fight our way out of Afghanistan. We're going to develop our way out of Afghanistan. But secondly, I think American people get it that we do not want to be an island of prosperity in a world of poverty. I think they understand that growth in developing countries is going to be the primary market for American exports and the primary means of creating American jobs in the future. Europe, Japan, other developed country markets are pretty much saturated, and the growth rate there is going to be relatively lower than what we're going to be seeing in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. And therefore, it's important to remind people that 13 of our 17 fastest growing export markets are in countries that currently or formerly received USAID assistance. But finally, I just go back to what I said at the end. I think the American people simply, for a moral and ethical reason, want us to protect and project our values international. They simply want to live in a world that's peaceful, that's prosperous, that's democratic, that's respectful of human rights and respectful of human dignity.
Rodney Ben.
Don, first, congratulations on a very successful tenure at AID, and congratulations on your next career. Two questions, not true or false. Looking back, what are you most proud of while you were at AID, and what did you find most frustrating?
God, I should have prepared for that. What I'm most proud of is pretty easy, this concept of inclusive development. The fact that I think we as an agency get that women and people with disabilities and the LGBT community, people who are displaced, ethnic minorities, indigenous populations, that they have to be front and center in this effort. And frankly, this wasn't always the case. I want to recount one story, and I won't tell what region or what country it was about, but when I first got to USAID, we instituted a system where every single project proposal had to have a gender impact statement. And you had to analyze how this was going to impact on women, how it would. You didn't necessarily have to have every project have a major impact on women, but you needed to at least consider the issue. So we got the first two responses we got, one was about building a bridge. And literally the response was 50% of the people using this bridge will be women. Literally. The next one was for a dam. And it said 50% of the water produced by this dam will be used by women. I said, hey, that's interesting. I really appreciate that. Have you ever thought about what's going to happen with the displacement of populations from the villages that is going to occur because of the construction of the dam? You know, what is that going to do to gender relationships in those communities? Have you thought about the fact that the vast majority of the people employed when you build the dam are going to be men? And what is that going to do to the local labor market and economic relationship? Have you considered whether the electricity produced in that dam is going to be used in households so that women won't have to cook with firewood inside? And we all know that 2 million women and children die each year from respiratory illnesses because of cooking inside. And they said, oh, yeah, well, we could have talked about that too. And in the 2.5 years that I've been at AID, there's a sea change. You now go out and, you know, one of the biggest projects we're doing, $315 million women's empowerment project in Afghanistan. People are including these principles, not just specific projects, but they're mainstreaming them. They're going into interagency meetings and saying, well, what about the impact on women of this policy that you're talking about? I think we have taken some very important steps, and I give tremendous credit to the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton for setting, and President Barack Obama for setting the moral and the ethical concepts there. I give great credit to Raj Shah for the work that he's done, Tina Chen, Valerie Jarrett, etc. But I am convinced that we are going a long way towards institutionalizing this and putting it into the DNA of our agency. What I'm most frustrated about is that I'm not sure what I just said is true. I have to say that these are long-term, as we were talking about before, these are long-term efforts. It's changing attitudes. It's saying to your Foreign Service national employee in a country where having relations between people of the same sex is both illegal and can even result in the death penalty, saying to that individual, keep your attitudes to yourself and implement programs to enhance the rights of LGBT persons in your community. It is making sure that the bureaus, and there are some that really haven't bought into this concept, do. It is training a new generation of people coming into USAID, and frankly, we're helped dramatically by the fact that 60% of our staff have been on the job 5 years or less. And they're coming in with new attitudes. They're coming in waiting to be convinced that AID can accommodate not only their development capacities, but their value structures. And the challenge and the frustration is that we haven't really consolidated this yet, but I think it's on the road.
I think we're going to have to end it there. Great. Thanks, Don. Please join me in thanking Don Steinberg. We've got a wine and cheese reception across the hall in room 147AB, but also note that the exhibit hall is open till 5:30, so I hope you'll, if you have one more, we're going to make one more run for the exhibit hall, please do that, but please join us in 147AB. Thanks, everybody, for all the time you've given. There have been a lot of people who've worked very hard to make this a success. I want to thank Rodney Bent. I want to thank Catherine Rafelson. I want to thank Elaine Potter. And I want to thank all the staff and volunteers who've made this possible. Thank you all very, very much.